All right, well, we might get started. So welcome everyone to yet another webinar on, looking at volunteer management best practices that the Centre for Volunteering is running on a regular basis. At the moment, I think we've had one every month for the last few months. So hopefully you've been able to partake in some of those and pick up some great insights and the like. And today will be no different. We've got a fantastic presentation that I will introduce shortly. But first, I would like to acknowledge country. We acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation at the Centre for Volunteering as the traditional custodians of the country we are meeting on today. We recognise their continuing connection to the land and waters and thank them for protecting this coastline and its ecosystem since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and extend that respect to all First Nations people present today. And if you'd like to pop into the chat box the land you're coming from, that's always a nice way to recognise the original custodians of the land as well. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Ayse Dalkic, who is one of our project managers at the Centre for Volunteering, and more importantly, she's actually a very experienced volunteer manager. She comes to us with an absolute wealth of knowledge, and I will not take any of her thunder and allow her to give a bit of an introduction of herself. I must say it's been an absolute pleasure working with her over the last few months since she's come on board and picking her brains on all things volunteer management, particularly as we've been working on various different resources to get out to you lovely people. So I hope you enjoy the session today and get a lot out of it. Please feel free to pop any questions as they come up into the chat window, and if we have time, we'll address those at the end. Otherwise, we can always get an FAQ out to you at the end. The session is being recorded, and just due to a little bit of a technical difficulty, you'll hear Ayse and myself. I'll be running the slides whilst Ayse will say to us kindly to go next. So if you do hear that, it's not that we're losing the plot, it's just to get around a little technical issue. So without any further ado, over to you, Ayse.
Thank you so much, Clint. Thank you for the warm welcome. It's absolutely a pleasure of mine to be here today and to be working with a great team at the Centre for Volunteering. So a bit of a background, very briefly. I actually started informal volunteering when I was a child, brought in to translate and interpret for family members and neighbours who needed some language support at the age of probably 10. And I've been reminded of that ever since, because sometimes I felt as though it was a bit over my head, the language that was used, or as a child not to have known the words in a different language. So volunteering has been instilled in me from a very young age from my family. Then I guess with my education, I went into commerce, marketing, and worked in the profit-making industries of banking and finance. And must say I didn't quite enjoy it, but the skills that I received up until that point has put me in good stead to work in the non-for-profit, which is where I steered myself towards in the last 20 years of my career. And that's been the most rewarding part of my career, is to be working in the non-for-profit. Initially with Motor Neurone Disease Association of New South Wales and fundraising assistant role there, but mainly that role required me to manage the volunteers for MND New South Wales, may it be at events and then formally at fundraising events as well. So all of that combined into volunteer management. And then the great opportunity came up about 10 years ago to start up the formal volunteer program at Royal Rehab, which has been an absolute pleasure and an honour to hold that position, where I was able to start up the volunteer program in an organisation that's now 120 years plus, providing rehabilitation for people with brain injury and spinal injuries. The reason why I go into detail of Royal Rehab, I guess now, is because obviously the experiences that I've had there are the experiences that I'll be sharing with you today. And the the volunteer roles that have been in from MND through to Royal Rehab have guided me as to how best practices I apply in engaging with volunteers in that organisation or any other. And obviously doing volunteering outside of my formal volunteering, continuing with schools and education programs or cultural diverse programs, I've lent myself to those formal and informal volunteering roles along the way. So thank you so much for putting yourself out there today and joining me. It's my pleasure to be presenting today and defining, obviously, beginning with the formal and informal volunteering, which is the next slide I'd like to go into. Clint, you are up. Okay, thank you. So formal volunteering is where you've well, we'll start with the definition, I guess, with the formal volunteering, which most of us will know is time willingly given for the common good without financial gain. But I'd like to go a little bit further and define it in my terms. For me, it's really quite simple. It's actually a gift. Volunteering in its informal interpretation to me is a gift where you give to humanity, you give back to community, you give back to your organisations that you may feel some sort of association or causal link to, whether it be the family members of people who might have had MND, or have known someone who had MND, or in a rehab setting and they would want to come back and give to that community, or you're joining volunteering because your family has always done it. It's a family tradition. Or you do it because you want to feel connected to your community and don't want to be isolated, or you've got some free time on your hands. Whatever it is, those reasons, that's your motivation. And that's the reason why you're going into some sort of formal or informal volunteering. And we hope that that whole journey from where to go, from being formally introduced or expressing your interest in volunteering to providing however many years or hours of service that you wish to do so with that organisation or multiple organisations, that you have a pleasant journey and that you leave happy, or don't leave at all. Some people don't, as we know. So if we just look at the statistics in the next slide, we'll see that the State of Volunteering report has gathered information that there is 30% volunteering in informal settings. So that's the sort of thing that I was speaking about earlier with schools and education, parents and citizens volunteering at FATES and what have you. And then the next statistics of 60% volunteering in both formal and informal setting. Today, I'll focus more on the formal setting and how to be able to prepare a role description for the volunteer that you're engaging with. So we'll have a look at the next slide, please. Thanks. Where if we tap into the national standards with engaging with volunteers, we'll actually get a lot of benefit out of looking at having a formal setting where we've got volunteers and receiving their documentation from whichever organisation they've chosen to engage their time with. When we are in a position of being a volunteer coordinator or a volunteer manager in an organisation structure, we may feel that we're actually in control of everything in terms of, bringing in a volunteer, appointing them, onboarding them, orienting them. But I actually feel that a lot of the shots are called by volunteers. They're in control because that's the gift they wish to give you, the organisation. We're all stakeholders in this. And if we do it right, we'll actually maintain that relationship for hopefully longer. And the resources that you've put in place to onboard the volunteers aren't wasted. So you're actually getting the best out of your volunteer. They're happy. They're staying, they're talking about it to their friends and neighbours, and they continue to enjoy that relationship with the organisation. So don't take any shortcuts when you're trying to onboard a volunteer. And obviously, one of the first things that they'll be doing is applying, making a phone call, whether it's through your website, making an inquiry, giving a phone call to you to say that they wish to volunteer, track everything, register their interests. And at that stage, they're actually suspects. They're called suspects because they're looking out for different things that they wish to volunteer their time with. And you want to make sure that the right person becomes a prospective volunteer through this journey. And if we do our role right in preparing for onboarding them with the right terminology used and the right structures in place to have the volunteer commit to that role by signing on the role description, you'll have a much better relationship with them, and then they'll become a volunteer. So the next slide, please. So I guess we introed this webinar and put a bit of description in the website to say, is it a role description or is it a position description? So I've been mindful of not using the term position description so that we're removing ourselves from any confusion that it is a paid role. And that's the only reason why we don't want to have that confusion with any industrial disputes, industrial confusion, conflict that we may have. We'll call it a role description. And it'll be based on what the organisation needs, first and foremost. There will be times when you'll receive an expression of interest from a volunteer and you haven't got a need for that role, or it hasn't been logged in your system as being a request from the organisation, but you may actually find that that role's got, the volunteer's got so many skills and attributes that you wish to create a role for them. And that is quite doable. You can sell that back to your organisation to say, this is a fantastic volunteer that's walked in, or prospective volunteer, and we'd like to engage with them. I had that incident at Royal Rehab where a young student wanted to provide their guitar playing for their benefit of having practicing, but they were actually so good. We never knew that they were practicing, but they were actually providing recreational therapy to our residents who lived in our supported accommodation. A couple of hours a week they would come and we would engage with them, and they would be exposing themselves to probably a different part of the community where they were a young person, hadn't been exposed to people with severe disabilities who may not have been able to communicate, but they were able to put a smile on the face of these people because they were providing something new and refreshing to the cohort of our residents. So when I was drafting the role description, I'd be looking at all the resources available to me. I'd speak to the existing volunteers that we had, even the exiting volunteers. Make sure that you've got surveys for your exiting volunteers and they can give their comments, and you put that back into your quality continuous improvement cycle so that you improve the systems that you have in place. The staff that are requesting the volunteers are the best place to start in knowing what you want to put on your role description for the volunteer. The team that the organisation's given you, whether it is a volunteer coordinator or you're the volunteer manager, or the resigning volunteer coordinator or manager, might be able to help you with some of the things that you can start building your systems and make sure that you've got the best system there for you, and that's the best practices that are being applied throughout the whole programs that you have in place or building to put in place. So the Centre for Volunteering is a peak body, obviously, that you are aware of, and referral systems, you can tap into them as well if there's some curly questions that you might have, or you're new to this area and you need a little bit of support. Okay, so if we could go to the next slide, please. So I feel that the roles, whether it's a volunteer coming to you or you're trying to attract a particular volunteer, is about managing their expectations. And you need to be able to define those expectations, and the information that's synthesized through your screening processes and onboarding processes is what's important that you need to put into your role description. So if volunteers are coming to you, or prospective volunteers are saying they've got time restraints, they've got exams, they have holidays, you need to be away for a couple of months. You need to be able to manage that and to reflect that back into the role description where the times are set, the expectations are there of what it is that they're to do. The role has to be valuable for the volunteer to be able to come back and continue to do it on a weekly basis or whatever the timeframes are. You need to be able to make sure that you've covered your risk matrix in your documentation so that they know that you are an organisation that hopefully has volunteer insurance policies in place, and that you've ascertained that the environment in which that they are to work in will be safe for them, whether it's a garden and they may be a volunteer that they are in a wheelchair, and that space will be safe for them to access and the tools will be appropriate for them to access. So that's the part of the onboarding and orientation, but that will also be documented in the role description. And I hope that that will be the case. Next slide, please. So there are some roles that the position may be where there is no formal written role description. It may be a verbal communication to you. And they may be in the form of a SMS program that they might have, say be there at a Macquarie shopping centre, for example. If you're a volunteer who'll be doing the Christmas wrapping, you might have that in a SMS. Or you might be asked to be there at a particular time, and then the role description might be given to you verbally whilst you're having a stand-up meeting and orientation to the process for that day event. Otherwise, you may go to the other extreme of where you're actually mirroring the HR, the Human Resources Department's position descriptions. And it all depends on the type of volunteering that you're engaging in. You may be a volunteer who's a multiple a serial volunteer who will go to different areas and different organisations and enjoy the different appeals of each of those volunteering roles. You may be a person who doesn't want to be in a hospital setting because you may have had that in your personal life and want to stay away from that sort of thing. You might choose other type of volunteering for whatever reason, to engage in a garden setting, for example, in community garden settings. So it's up to the volunteer managers and coordinators who wish to be able to set up a system where they can have the volunteer clearly communicated to their expectations and vice versa. Next slide, please. So in writing the role description, I've said before, is to obviously provide the language and clear communication. The tasks are outlined specifically, and sometimes you may not have that specifications, but at least the groundwork and the framework is there and outlined in the document that you have or in the communique that you wish to provide your volunteer. Make sure you do include some perks in the volunteer role. If your community, the neighbouring community cafes might be providing some sort of pro bono, free coffees or discounted giftware or what have you, as long as the volunteer is provided with an identification that they are a volunteer, like a photo ID badge or free parking, for example, in hospital settings. These are all perks, and it's fantastic if you can share that with your volunteer, and it gives them a reminder that these things are available for them. For example, at Raw Rehab, we also had employee assistance packages. They were support packages where if you felt that you needed some sort of counselling, that was freely available to you as well as the staff. You knew that you were held equally, respectfully in that role as a volunteer. And that was stipulated in the actual role description. And it was a good reminder. In the beginning, you may not realize all these things, but as you go through your role, and you may find that there are some times where you're a bit down, you can then realize and communicate that back to your supervisor. If you needed them to help you, they'll be able to support you through this process as well. So it'd be also very valuable if you're able to put in place and document that you've covered the risks and the work health and safety issues that the volunteer may encounter, and have your volunteer insurance policy documented, if you wish to say that we have got that and it's current. And that's really important for volunteers to know, that they're not entering a space where they're being taken advantage of in any way, that their role is there to add value to the organisation, where they're the mission and the vision of that organisation is clearly communicated to them in all through the communications, whether it's verbal or written. But the actual role description is after the volunteer application form, the formal agreement in terms of, this is what I wish to offer you, which you've heard and you've registered, and these are the role that the organisation has deemed me to be suitable for. Doesn't mean that you're stuck to that role description. It means that it's at least one step in a formal setting, and best practices are being applied in engaging with volunteers in this organisation. You are respected as a valued member of that team alongside with staff. Next, thanks. Okay, so there are roles where you may be facing the public in terms of community volunteering, where no role description is given to you in a written form, for example, or in the way that which I'm concentrating on today. For example, charity shops may have like Binny's, Salvos, and Achieve. I'm not saying that they don't. I have been to a fair few of these charity shops, and I had a bit of an opportunity to do some research and ask if they've been given any of this sort of documents. Some have said yes, some haven't. There may be opportunities where you might be a volunteer at Bunnings for an organisation, and you know that you go there at a particular time of that morning and be given that orientation of what's safe practices to be engaged with, and they'll be demonstrated to you as to what's expected of you in the hours that you will be there. And then that's a role description in itself. You may be engaged in little athletics or school fetes, and these may be, as I said previously, the verbal or SMS or stand-up debriefing on that occasion. You may even have just a one-page of volunteer pledge where you're saying that you will be respectful and you will engage with appropriate clear communication languages with the clients that you have to face, and you know who to ask for help from when in need. There will also be occasions where you may just be adequately covering what you need to do with a day run sheet. For example, if you've got a group of corporates who wish to engage with your organisation, and you've given them the day run sheet of when to turn up, what to wear, what shoes to wear, the dress code, and you've covered when presentations will take place and what the benefits are in terms of what their engagement will be, the confidentiality clauses that are necessary to be observed. That may all be what is required for that day and that occasion and that event. Thank you. Next slide. So because of my background, I guess I'll focus a little bit again back on the formal volunteering setting and the role descriptions. I'm actually going to share with you one of the role descriptions that I had put forward at Royal Rehab and developed, and does initially mirror quite the human resources position descriptions for staff, but the terminology is definitely tailored towards a volunteer role, so that they know they are engaging with clients in a particular manner, but they are there for set hours, and it's documented, and it's great for our record keeping. And because that volunteer role description has a date, you've actually got a start date from that day forward. And that really helps at the end of all this, where you wish to be able to, and hopefully do, recognise and reward your volunteers with the award nominations. It actually is a document where most of my volunteer nominations have been the resource that I've fallen back to collect all the information as to what that volunteer had been doing since what particular time, the hours that they've put in and logged, and that is the actual essence of the volunteer nominations that I'd be using going forward. So I'll share with you in the next slide the actual role description. I'm sorry for the amount of words that are in there, but it was quite a comprehensive role, and this role was a physiotherapy assistant role. So we weren't using terms like just physiotherapy. We'd say physiotherapy, and it's titled a volunteer role description at the physiotherapy clinic. There'll be multiple days in which a volunteer could come, but because it was tailored to the specific availability of that volunteer, which is important to recognise that we don't dictate this is when you have to come, but obviously try and find the right suitable volunteer that is available with the right attributes and skill sets to be able to perform this role. In this particular case, the Monday morning, that they would be there on a weekly basis, and the purpose in which that they're there is to be able to repeat the things that the staff member would say. So they'd be observing and counting and asking them to walk the bar of the physiotherapy gymnasium several times and document all this. And what's essential in here is that the communication is clear. It's mission driven in terms of the therapy that that client is to, the patient is to achieve. And the volunteer there is to assist the staff member, assist the client, and overall, hopefully, have a great time doing it as well, and building relationships within the community. So first page is really the description of the role and what we ask of and require of the volunteer. The second page is more so advising of the volunteer that what we will be doing for them, which is to provide that orientation and training on site, reminding them of the benefits of this role to the volunteer, as well as for the organisation. And then we'll go into the nitty-gritty of a little bit of an introduction into the policy and procedures that we have obviously got greater documentation for, but at least it gives the volunteer an introduction that we have got a professional system there, and that we will refer to it if need be. For example, no bullying, no harassment, no discrimination, observing the principles of multiculturalism, and having a standard of code of conduct that we would expect of them. And on the next page, we'll see that next slide where we've got the actual risk matrix really for their work health and safety, where we've actually gone through and documented the number of, I suppose, the high risk or the low risks of potential things that could happen. And therefore, we are expressing to them that we're diligent in our respect of their time and their safety, and making sure that they feel safe before they come and access this sort of role. We'll sign off on this role as accepting them in this position, obviously once they've signed on the dotted line, and we've got this document for us for our policies and checklists that we've gone through. It's important for us to recognise that any documentation is a fantastic way of keeping records. That's why I said in the outset, it is a roadmap. It is important to not take any shortcuts in this, and to collaborate and communicate with all the resources, the stakeholders. If you're starting up a volunteer program, it's really important to know what your executive, your management, your board wants to achieve, not just we'd like X number of volunteers by the end of the year, but what are the roles that you want these volunteers to add value to your organisation. and being mindful that they're not to replace any staff, and these volunteers should be doing less than 16 hours per week in your organisation. So you're not replacing any staff. The staff aren't threatened that their roles are being eroded in any way. It's adding value to the organisation and on the same path that you're aligned with the mission and vision of the organisation, with communicating that through back to the actual volunteer, and they've accepted it by signing on the role description. Next slide. So the outcomes that we wish to achieve, obviously, is to have a community, a healthy, thriving community where the volunteers will have some sort of cultural competency and engage with across the community with these roles and the variety of roles that are available in this community. We are a very lucky country in that we can provide quite a lot of volunteering. Obviously, with the pandemic, a lot of things has had to be revised, and the outcome of that is, being able to do things differently. One of the things that I enjoyed doing through, I guess, the hurdles of the pandemic and not being able to provide face-to-face volunteering and not having contact with our vulnerable communities was to be able to shift our volunteering from face-to-face to virtual volunteering. And that's been a real joy in being able to do that through the pandemic period. And then that gave us time to be able to change and re-observe the risk matrix, and therefore train the volunteers with the hand hygiene modules of training, or their PPE, protection equipment that we needed to provide for them, and to make sure that they had their RAT tests available at the entry, if they were to be able to come back into the hospital setting or a rehab setting or a community home where it was a supported accommodation. So having the role description had brought that volunteer into your organisation because you've already aligned, you've made that decision that they're aligned and that they will follow instructions and that they will be coming and going as you advise them. So that clear communication has to be a thread for this community to thrive. And it's important from the outset that we attract the volunteers that have got the interests and the knowledge, skills and attributes that are consistent with obviously the anti-discrimination legislation that you would have in your policies in place as well. Next slide. Another part of obviously having the right documentation is that you hope that the outcomes would be where you've got open and respectful discussions throughout your whole cohort with your staff, your executive, your management, your clients, and your volunteers. And if there is the unfortunate events where there are misunderstandings and conflict, you've got your policies in place to be able to go back to, and that's why you give that introduction in your role descriptions. You don't have to rewrite the whole thing into your role descriptions, but if you can allude to it with small short sentences, you've got that covered. And if there are any conflict or where there's rogue, it's unfortunate if that would happen, but if it did, that you would come back and be able to have invite the volunteer back in and have clear communication with them to say some things were observed that weren't right. Can we address these issues? Was it what was going on? And just get them to be able to have a conversation with you. So don't judge, open the door. Always have an open door policy as a volunteer coordinator or a manager so that they know that you are available to discuss if they've got any concerns or issues that they need to, and that they feel supported in every step of the way in their onboarding through their whole relationship with the organisation. Next. So As I said, the role description should remove any form of uncertainty and reduce any confusion and conflict, leading to improved retention rates. So you're employed, or you may not be. There might be a voluntary role that you might do, but in the role of volunteer manager or volunteer coordinator, the effort that you're putting in on onboarding a volunteer is incredible. So the resources that you're using of the organisation would lend itself for you to be able to retain your volunteers for the period of time that it's set. We would normally have asked our volunteers to stay for a 6-month period, but found that most of our volunteers stayed much longer. And that retention rate is critical in having a harmonious team in which all stakeholders are happy with the engagement and they wish to stay. So when I said to you in the beginning of having suspects, the volunteers are suspects because they're actually sussing out what is available in the community where they can volunteer. Then they become prospects when they start filling in forms and become a volunteer. Then you'd like them to actually stay on as volunteers. But time is a resource, and they may not have enough time to stay on. So, or their work commitments have changed, or their study commitments have changed, or they've relocated, so they may move on. But if it is in a position that they were so happy, they may come back, so they'll become repeats in that journey. And if they come back and then they are so happy, they tell their community about it. Most people tell their friends and family, or 14 of their friends and family when they're not happy. But when they are happy, we'd like them to be raving about you, and that they'll be raving fans about your organisation. And oftentimes they'll bring in another friend to volunteer in your organisation because you might have mentioned that there's another role available. So for you to maintain your relationship with your volunteers and improve your retention rates in the organisation for your volunteers is quite important, to not waste the resources that have been given to you to be able to run the volunteer program. And if you've got satisfied customers or satisfied volunteers, it's all part of the customer service that you're providing. You're building stronger communities. You're a glue in the community. And this is the fabric. And one of the threads in making this fabric strong is obviously putting that proper role description, well thought out, where I would say the 80% of the planning is done with your team and your staff and your people that have employed you. So you've got everyone's expectations on board when you're writing and drafting your role description for your volunteers, and expressly communicating that through to your volunteers and rejigging it if need be. Because once they've done their first shift, give them a call or go by where they are and ask them how they are, get their feedback, rejig it, retweak it if necessary, if it isn't right, or they've highlighted things that you might not have seen and it wasn't that you were aware of at the time. So that you continue to improve the quality of the service that you're providing. You can do survey monkeys. Make sure you do have an exit survey. Send it out to them, or even if they come in and say to you that they're resigning, hand it over to them there and then. If they could complete that survey, that would be fantastic. Throughout this process, I hope that it's been clear that a role description is quite essential in having a formal volunteering role. It's part of the best practices in volunteer engagement and involvement. It's not a hard task. Use the resources that are available to you, the staff that are your colleagues, and as I said earlier, with the volunteers that have done the role in the past, sometimes even give them a call, even if they've retired. It'll be a friendly courtesy call to them to find out how they're doing, if they've resigned or moved on, just to let them know that you're still thinking of them, and tap into their knowledge and their wealth. Some volunteers may be in that role for decades. One of my volunteers was at Raw Rehab for over 30 years, And I'm sure others have got other stories from their volunteers of how long they've been doing their volunteering. So tap into these beautiful gems in our community, and the joy that they will hopefully share back with you, and improve the quality of the service that you wish to either start up or continue or improve in your role, in your privileged role of being a volunteer manager or a volunteer coordinator, because I do believe that it is a gift that we are doing and providing to the community in all ways. So the next slide is what I was saying in a nutshell, to be able to build stronger communities. And that was my community that I was in at Royal Rehab. And I just wanted to share that with you, with a group of our volunteers at Government House. And so hopefully you've got some questions, and hopefully I can answer them. Just also a reminder that the next webinar will be the topic of supervising and managing of volunteers on 22nd of September at the same time. And I hope you can join me then. Thank you.